So I was probably 17 or 18, and my oldest sister and I decided to beat my father out because it was a windy day, and we love sailing. My dad had a 19-foot Lightning, and we thought, wow, there's wind in the trees for like the first time. Let's get and use that wind. So we went to the lagoon and we got the boat ready, and as we began to sail out into what is Orient Harbor, this is the end of the North Fork on Long Island in New York, the wind picked us up so fast, I realized Dad had never had us sail on days that were that windy. And we raced out there, we shot out there, we were like a mile and a half out before we realized this is way too much wind for us. And so I kept saying to Krista, let go of the sail, let the sail out. And when she did, the mainsail hit the water. And if you are a boater, you know that if the mainsail hits the water, the boat goes over like that with the mast this way. Now, I had no preparation for being capsized. I had no idea what you do. And so here I am sitting on the top and thinking, I have to get off the boat. So I jumped right onto the centerboard and bruised my ribs. So Krista, meanwhile, she's 4 years older. She should know what to do. She's trying to figure out how to get the sail down because it's weighting the boat down. And I'm in the water on the other side, and I decided we should call help. The real problem was that there was nobody out there. In other words, everyone knew it was way too much wind. And so I start yelling, help, and she comes swimming around real fast. What's wrong? What's wrong? And I said, 1, 2, 3, let's yell it together. And she was puzzled. I was right. That was the only thing to do at that moment because we were not going to be able to get that boat back into shore, and our dad was not showing up for another hour or two. And he would quickly figure out that the boat was gone in the lagoon and there was no boat sailing there except the one that was down. Dealing with forces beyond what you can understand. The disciples still have no idea. This is relatively early in Jesus' ministry. And what you need to know is that Jesus has heard only like a half a day before that John the Baptist, his cousin, his colleague, a fellow prophet, John the Baptist has been beheaded. And everyone heard that the head of John the Baptist on the platter was presented to Salome, who had danced for King Herod, and that she brought it to her mother. And John the Baptist's disciples had gone and gotten the rest of his body to bury it properly. And Jesus is grieving. And he wants to go up in a mountain to pray, and he gets in a small boat, and when he gets off, he realizes the people had seen him, and they all came swarming around. They had walked where he had gone to be in the wilderness. And so rather than just go up the mountain to pray, he attends to them. He heals them. He talks to them. And the disciples finally show up around evening tide, and they say, Jesus, you got to send them away. And he says, no, we'll feed them. And the disciples say, how are we going to do that? And he says, what do you have? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So he has them sit down. This is the feeding of the 5,000 men, plus women and children. So it's maybe 10,000 people. Right? And he blesses the bread and the fish, breaks it, and passes it out, and there are 12 baskets full. So by now, his compassion for them has been astonishing, but he still wants to pray. And so he sends the disciples off in that little boat he was in all alone, and he tells the people to go away, and he finally goes up the mountain to pray. And the disciples are out on the water, and the wind comes up, a storm comes up, and they're hysterical, crying. And it's in the fourth watch of the night, which is 3 to 6 a.m. So let's say it's 4 a.m. or 5 a.m., and Jesus walks out on the water. And they scream. They've seen a ghost. A phantasm is what the Greek says. And they're upset. And he says, don't be afraid. Ego eimi. It is I. Do not fear. And Peter, sounding a little bit like Satan in the wilderness, says, Lord, if it's you, then tell me to come to you. Jesus says, come. And Peter starts to walk on the water. You need to know that. Peter walks on the water. He's walking on the water. And then he looks at the waves and the wind, and he starts sinking. And he says what we need to remember to say, oh, Lord, save me. Lord, save me. And Jesus holds out his hand and says, you of little faith. And what Jesus actually says in the Greek is little faith. He calls him little faith. He doesn't have perfect faith. He doesn't have no faith at all. He has just a little faith, not enough to realize who this Jesus is. I imagine that when Jesus put his hand out and Peter grabbed it, I imagine that Peter never forgot the rest of his life what that felt like to have Jesus pull him out. And they both climb onto the ship. And then the disciples say, truly, you are the Son of God. They're still trying to figure it out. And the winds and the waves cease, and suddenly they're at shore. We're dealing with the God who created heaven and earth. We are forever underestimating the power of God. When I tell people that I'm afraid of God, they say, why? God's my friend, God's my buddy. Well, God changed my life. I was going in one direction as a musician. I had a doctorate in music, and I had a powerful spiritual experience, and I felt like God was saying, I want you to be a priest, and I didn't want to be a priest. My father's a Lutheran minister, 28 men in my family who were Lutheran ministers. I didn't want to do that. But that voice was persistent over a year and a half, asked my husband, and it was quite a struggle. It was quite a struggle. And when I finally said yes and everything fell into place, I realized I was terrified of a God who could turn me upside down and change my life so completely. Elijah is burned out. He's a prophet. He's just done this huge thing with the priests of Baal. Remember, there's no water, and so they have this contest, and they're up on the mountain, and all of the sons of Israel, he keeps complaining about it. You know, they broke the covenant. They've torn down the altars because Jezebel now is the wife of the king of Israel, Ahab, and she has her own gods to Baal, and so everyone's starting to go to Baal, and Elijah is furious and exhausted. And so the priests of Baal try to call their Baal to come and bring water, and they do all sorts of limping weird things around the altar, and they do all their stuff, and Baal doesn't come. And Elijah rebuilds the altar, and he cuts up the ox, and he has them pour water on the altar 3 times. So it's soaking wet, and there's a ditch around it. And then he prays to God to show these people that God is God. And fire comes down, and the sacrifice is burned up completely, as well as the dust and everything around it. And then he has to kill the prophets of Baal. And he goes down into the wadi, and I guess there are other people that help him because there are 450 of them. And then he runs into the wilderness. And he knows that Jezebel is going to be angry at him, and he actually finds out by running ahead of somebody else like a mile and a half that she has put out an order that he should be killed within 24 hours. And so he runs to the desert of Damascus, sits under a broom tree, and prays to God that he will die. And he falls asleep. And an angel wakes him up. And there's a cake on a hot stone, and there's water. And this angel says, please eat and drink, because you won't have energy otherwise. And he does. Wondering if he's dreaming, falls asleep again. The angel wakes him up again, gives more food and drink, and then he has to walk 40 miles to Mount Horeb, to the Mount of God. And a voice says to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And I imagine it doesn't sound like Cecil B. DeMille. I don't think it's, what are you doing here, Elijah? I think it's, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah says, well, I've been very zealous for God, and I've done this, and nobody else has done it, and I'm the only one left. The voice tells him to go into a cave on the mountain, and he does that. And then there are winds that break everything apart, trees fall down, and he's looking for God, and God isn't there. And then there's an earthquake, God isn't there. There's a wind, and God isn't there. And then, translations don't know what to do with this. There's a sound of sheer silence, of gentle murmuring, of silence between mountain breezes. It's interesting to see what they come up with. Somehow, that voice that's quiet says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah then talks of his prophetic burnout. I'm just exhausted, and look what I've done for you, and no one else believes in you. And his name, Elijah, means the Lord is God. And he just says, I've had it. You know, be impressed with my ministry. That's what I get out of it. And God says, okay, here's what you're going to do. Here's your next assignment. And the assignment is to make Hazael king, and to make Jehu king, and to make Elisha his replacement. It's not, good job, Elijah, you did great. It's okay, we'll pass on the mantle. And that's exactly the way ministry is. You keep passing on the mantle. And if you don't do it, God will call someone else to do it. But if it's burning in your heart, you got to do it. Because it's part of who you are. It's part of your identity. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowing that God is more powerful than you can imagine. And certainly, since I was a kid, there's so many more galaxies and stuff going on in the universe, God keeps getting bigger and bigger. Like, how is that even possible? And smaller as we find out all the ways that all this life is connected. It's astonishing. So, I'm calling help. I'm in the water, and I'm in pain, and there's no one out there. And a motorboat shows up with two guys. And it had to be two guys because it was hard to right the boat, to get the sails down in the water. They're soaking wet, they're canvas, they're old sails, and they're very heavy. And then to be able to pull the boat into the shore, where my father is standing like this. It was very embarrassing. But it was a lesson. And what I realized was, it was my father's job to teach us what to do if the boat capsizes. And instead, what he had done was never capsize the boat. But that doesn't help us for what's going to happen in life. And so we, like the disciples, have got to learn about how to listen, receive the call, and then figure out what God is calling us to do. And we all get it wrong. It's not possible to get it right. And the way we learn best is by getting it wrong and never forgetting it. And I just see Jesus holding out his arm and Peter grasping his hand and thinking, thanks be to God. Amen.